Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show where we have philosophical discussions and helping you develop and reason through your views. In today's episode, I speak with philosopher Daniel Layman. We speak on a book co-authored with him with Michael Huemer on If Political Authority is an Illusion. The book is designed in a debate type format where you have one interlocutor speaking for the proposition and another one speaking against. If you find value in what I'm doing, please consider liking, subscribing, and rating and reviewing the podcast as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. And without further ado, I bring you Dr. Daniel Layman. All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode to the Reason Through podcast. Today with me, I have Dr. Daniel Layman. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, definitely. And before we get started on today's topic, if you don't mind telling our listeners who you are and what you do.
Sure. Yeah. So I am Dan Layman. I am associate professor of philosophy at Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina. It's a small liberal arts college just north of Charlotte. I am a professor of philosophy, but I specialize in political philosophy, which is what's sometimes called political theory. And what we do is ask questions about big, sort of fundamental conceptual issues about politics. So, for instance, what is liberty as a political value? Or germane to this discussion, what authority, if any, does the government have to tell us what to do and why? And then also the history of those questions back through various epochs of intellectual development, including, in my case, especially the early modern period, period that spanned about roughly the year 1600 to 1800 and included figures like John Locke, about whom I write a great deal, as well as others like David Hume, Adam Smith, and that gang. So that's basically what I do.
Perfect. How'd you kind of get into philosophy, or what, like, because I know, like, and I think I've asked this to a lot of different, people that I've had on, where there's philosophy in general is so broad, or there's just so many different subsets of philosophy, like ethics and then, or moral philosophy, and then epistemology. So how'd you kind of get into political philosophy when you're kind of doing your education?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I actually got into political philosophy well after I got into philosophy. I got into philosophy early on in college because I was actually interested in theological questions. I was interested in questions about God and his existence or lack thereof, as the case may be, and free will and things like that. That's what, when I was, maybe 18, 19 years old, really caught my attention. From there, I got interested in a series of other things. For a while, especially this area of philosophy called meta-ethics, which is the part of ethics that's not about so much how you should behave, but about what kind of status assertions about good and bad have and why they have that status. I thought I wanted to do that when I went to graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill. It became clear to me that was really not what I wanted to do. And after a brief period of floundering, I found this really terrific mentor in the retired legal philosopher Jerry Postema, who took me under his wing and showed me some really, really cool problems in political philosophy and its history. And from there, I found my way to Locke and liberalism stuff, and then it was off to the races. So although I got interested in philosophy very early on, it took me several years of that path to get interested in these questions in particular.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I guess we can kind of move into today's topic, which is political authority and illusion, which is co-authored. You and Professor or Dr. Michael Huemer kind of had an exchange. If you want to just kind of giving a little bit preliminaries about kind of the book, a little bit, what readers may be kind of finding or what they would find within the book.
Absolutely. So, Is Political Authority an Illusion is a entry into this really cool series of books being put out by the academic press Routledge. And each of these books takes two philosophers who disagree on some important philosophical topic and has them write a series of chapters in response to one another. So the reader gets to see, sort of playing out in front of them on the page, an actual exchange, a debate between philosophers on this topic. And we wrote the book, and we were asked to write the book in a way that's accessible to non-specialists. So although the book is not, in my judgment, exactly easy, it doesn't require a lot of background knowledge or facility with technical concepts. It's meant to be accessible to someone who maybe hasn't studied a lot or any philosophy, but is just interested in this question. Yeah, that's the basic character of the book.
Perfect. And so you kind of so in answering the question, where do you typically fall, or where did you fall? Answering the question, is there political authority? Is it an illusion?
I don't believe it's an illusion. No, I think that many uh, entities, states, governments that claim to have it, in fact, don't have it. But that's not because authority itself is illusory or simply not to be had at all, which is my co-author's position. I think that states can and sometimes do have, to a quite considerable degree, political authority, and those states include, again, to a considerable degree, not to a perfect degree, as we'll discuss, such familiar states to the listeners as United States, Canada, states like that.
Do you think that? So this is just, I guess, more of a, I don't know how to say this kind of question, but I feel as I was reading this, as I was reading the book, I don't know if it was just a bad title. I know it's kind of it's there to kind of get someone's attention, kind of like with thumbnails when you have on YouTube and stuff like that. And the reason
Mhm.
why I think it maybe have been a bad title is because I don't think like Dr. Humor's position is that it's illusory. Because when I think of an illusion, right? Illusion is something that we think is there, but it really isn't there. Now, maybe that is his position, but he readily, I think, in the book admitted like here is a count that like if the state is justified or has authority, it's very minimal. And if he's already, and in my mind, it's like if someone's already granting that, or if someone's granting that, there's some authority or relationship between the state and its citizens, but that wouldn't make it
Sure.
like illusory. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
So, as I understand his position, of course, he's the authority on his own position. He thinks there is an important sense in which it is illusory in the way you describe, and that he thinks that a lot of us, most of us, go around believing that the state has some substantial standing to tell us what to do, and that we have some substantial, maybe incomplete but significant duty to do what it says because it says it. And he thinks that that widespread belief, though widespread, is not correct, right? That we've been going through our lives under a kind of spell. And once it's removed, we'll see that, in fact, these entities, though very real and very powerful, don't have the kind of moral standing that we think they do.
yeah. So yeah, why don't we lay out, kind of moving forward a little bit, laying out your position, and then I'll try to be the person that is arguing against, or kind of speaking and standing for Mike Humor.
Terrific.
Yeah.
So, as we've already said, I do think that states can and sometimes do to a considerable degree have political authority. And let me start by saying what political authority is. So, political authority is actually the conjunction or combination of two more basic moral properties. So, one is political legitimacy, right? And we say that a state is legitimate to the extent that it has a right to issue and enforce rules. So, the United States, for instance, is legitimate with respect to, say, its with any law at all, to the extent that it has standing to say, "Hey, this is what you got to do," and then to make us do it. Political obligation is the other component of political authority, and that's a matter of whether we have a moral obligation to do what the government says. And although those are related, they're distinct. We can imagine a case of an entity having standing to issue a rule and even to enforce the rule, but the person on whom it's enforced having a moral right to just evade that enforcement if he or she can. And that would be a case of legitimacy, but not obligation. Typically, though, we think these tend to go together. Typically, accounts that give you the one give you the other, and so we have this name for the two together, which is political authority, right? And I think that states can and often do have this insofar as they do something really important for us. That is, insofar as they make it possible for people to relate to one another as equal rights holders. So, Mike and I actually agree that rights, that is, claims or standings to sort of insist on things against one another, is at the core of not just political authority, but political philosophy. We agree that an adequate account of the state's authority, should there be such an account, will be, in some sense, a matter of our rights. And I think that the way that works is that if we didn't have a state, we would suffer from three really important defects with respect to our rights. And those would be defects that would not just make things bad or unpleasant or undesirable, although things probably would be bad, unpleasant, and undesirable. That's not really the point. The point is that if we face these three defects, we fail to relate as free and equal right holders at all. So I call these the state of nature defects because in political philosophy, we use the term state of nature, which is a term that comes from early modern figures like Locke and Hobbes to describe a state of affairs in which some plurality of people do not have any kind of state regulating their interactions. Okay? So I argue that under those conditions, as in the conditions of not having a state, we would have three really serious problems with our rights. So one, our rights would be very significantly indeterminate. Right? That is, there would be really reasonable, persistent disagreement about where exactly one person's rights end and another one's begins. So, for example, in the state of nature, if I am holding an apple in my hand, most people, I think, could agree that's a pretty clear case of my having a right to the apple. Right? But what if I set the apple down for 3 days? Maybe it's going to rot on day 4 or 5. Have I abandoned it? I don't know. Maybe I need to come back. Right? May you take it? Frankly, it's kind of hard to say. Now take an even harder case. Suppose I do some complicated project with land, right, that involves me altering it slowly. Like, how much of it do I get a right to? How far does my right extend? Do I have to have touched it? It's really hard to say, just sort of from intuition, even if we're all people of goodwill, what the answer is. It's like we have a problem of making our rights determinate. So that's one problem. 2, our rights are subject to a kind of lack of sort of adjudication, right? So when there's disagreements, there's a problem about how to settle those in a way that doesn't boil down, and this is a term that's going to be really important to me, boil down to raw arbitrary power, right? In a way that doesn't boil down to the sheer fact of someone's will being in a position to be enforced on someone else. Right? So that's the second defect. And 3, relatedly, there's a worry about security, right? If our rights, supposing somehow we did determine them, are sort of subject to being invaded by others, simply whenever it's the balance of power of individual people's power works out that way, then we're constantly subject to other people's arbitrary wills with respect to our rights. I think these 3 defects are not just, again, bad in the sense of being undesirable, although that's probably true, but they make it the case that we're not really equal rights holders at all. Because in my view, to have a right is not just to, one, be in a moral position to say, hey, that's mine, or hey, don't. Or even to say, hey, that's mine, or hey, don't, in such a way that no one actually invades you. You have to be able to say, hey, that's mine, or hey, don't. Not be invaded, and not be invaded regardless of what anyone else's personal will or preference might happen to be. If you don't have those, you don't relate to one another as equal rights holders. And my basic case for the state is that unless we have an equally accountable body that can determine, adjudicate, and enforce our rights in such a way that it answers to all those for whom it does that, we're going to be subject to arbitrary power in a way that undermines, or as I say, vitiates our rights. So the thought is not that, the state gets to violate our rights because it's important. My claim is no, we don't really get to relate to each other as rights holders at all unless the state's in the picture and doing its work. So there's more, but that's the basic conceptual core of my case.
Yeah. Kind of before we kind of dive deeper into a little bit of how you kind of spell it out, especially with accountability, and I definitely like the examples that you've used in the book. But so prior to your account, or prior, kind of like delineating between your account, how have traditionally or classically some philosophers have tried to justify the state? Because there are different types of, like, social contract theory is one that gets brought up,
Right.
and there's a type of consequentialism that gets brought up as well.
Exactly. Yeah, there are lots of theories about this. I mean, this is one of the perennial problems of political philosophy. It's been in the Western discussion at least since Plato wrote his dialogue, the Crito, way back in the late 5th century BC, I believe, around then. So I'm not here a number of other proposals. So one, maybe those famous, which you mentioned, is the social contract. And this is the view that the state has authority because we all, those of us subject to the state, in some way agree to the state's authority, or as we typically say in political philosophy, consent to it. Um, this has a number of famous problems, which Mike points out, I think, honestly, quite successfully in his part of the book, including one, the absence of anyone ever asking for our consent. It seems that my consent doesn't seem to make a lot of difference to whether the state does what it does. Two, if you want to appeal to a person's sort of choice not to leave a community as tacitly or silently giving consent, there's a lot of worries about the enormous costs someone has to bear in order not to remain in a state. That seems to undermine the legitimacy of the consent doctrine. So there are many reasons to worry that may not succeed. And one of the first philosophers to raise those concerns was David Hume, and this is in the 18th century. He offered a kind of, as you said, a consequentialist argument. His thought was, look, forget about all this consent business. The way the state's going to end up with authority is if it sort of makes sense in terms of the results to treat the state as if it has authority. So on this view, don't worry about who gave up their rights to whom. Just compare state and non-state outcomes, and then if you like the outcomes of state outcomes, like state outcomes better, well, then you've got your case for state authority. The trouble with that is that it seems to fail to take seriously something that the consent theory, for all of its problems, does take seriously. And that's we call the separateness of persons, the fact that each person as an individual autonomous being matters. And it's no answer to my question, hey, why does the state get to make me do stuff? For you to point out and say, hey, look around, like the consequences for all this other stuff are really great. It looks like I can say, okay, but that's not what's at issue. The issue is, why does my will get to be overridden by these other wills? And it's not clear that the utilitarian view, as that view is sometimes called, does a great job with that. And there are others as well. There are appeals to sort of playing fair. You accept benefits, you should pay out obedience in return for the benefits. And there's some others as well, but those are a few of the other attempts. And I actually agree with Mike, my co-author, that those are not successful.
Perfect. All right, so let's move on a little bit, how your account tries to solve some of the problems that have arose, and then, because a lot of it does, I feel like, heavily weighs a little bit on like the accountability part, and to our rights, to where we can hold people accountable, or we have the state to hold others accountable for them not impinging on our rights and stuff like that. But yeah,
right.
You don't mind kind of sharing your account on this?
Right. So you're right that that's one of the central concepts, because we need accountability in order to get this idea, which is so important to me, of freedom from arbitrary power up and running. Although freedom from an arbitrary will, put it this way, although an arbitrary will is not just sort of conceptually identical to an accountable will, an arbitrary will is a will that's sort of literally unconstrained, like from the arbitrary, from the Latin arbitrium, or choice. It just sort of can choose as it will. I do argue that the way to make sense of a properly constrained, and so a non-arbitrary will, is in terms of accountability. And I think that what we mean when we say that a will is accountable, that is some person or group's behavior is accountable to someone else, what that means is that those subject to the power, so in the most obvious case, the citizens, right, have to be able to do a few things. So one, they have to be able to insist in their own voices, as it were, hey, these are our rights. Here's why we have them, and here's why you have to respect them. Right? And two, there have to be mechanisms in place and on which those citizens can rely, they can use to reliably actually ensure that those rights are respected by agents of the state, regardless of what the personal preferences of those agents of the state might happen to be. So if I'm living in a state where there's a ruler, and this ruler is just the best, this ruler recognizes all of our rights, they're super good at moral philosophy, they identify them all correctly, and they always respect them. But in point of fact, we're more or less powerless against this guy, right? Were this person to just become otherwise, become less good at moral philosophy, misidentify our rights, stop caring about them, if we can't reach to mechanisms, right, which are available to all the relevantly affected people, so in a democracy to all of us, and say, we're going to block you somehow, right? We're going to block your ability to invade our rights. If we lack that, there's no accountability. So to hold someone to be power to be accountable is for power to relate to the person over whom it's held in such a way that the person subject to the power can say, hey, these are my rights. You need to answer for them. And here's how I, or we, as the case might be, are going to make you do that. That's the basic structure of accountability.
Yeah, and I think one of the examples you used in the book was a professor kind of grading his students or her students' tests or whatever the case, homework, whatever. And even though it could be the professor could be really good at grading, they're always fair. But if there's not that mechanism kind of in place to when there is such a time where it could be maybe they're had a bad day or something like that,
Yeah,
students
exactly.
need to
I
appeal to
was
something.
grading papers before I got on this call, and I
Yeah.
knew I'd be talking about accountability, and that example came back to mind. And
Hmm.
there I am grading these papers, and I'm trying to be fair. I hope I'm being fair. But if it were the case that, fair or not, right, my students could just do nothing about it. If their position were the same, regardless of whether I slave over every detail to get it right, versus just throwing them down the stairs. Right? If they're in the same position with respect to what they can do about it, that I'm unaccountable, right? And my power over them is arbitrary, which means, in my judgment, they are unfree. They're unfree in the way that counts, even if in fact I don't throw them down the stairs, throw the papers, not the kids, down the stairs, and in fact do elect to grade them fairly.
Okay, so let me give, I guess, a little bit of, um, I guess, proper defense. Maybe I don't know if I'll do
Mhm.
my humor justice on this, but he starts off very lucidly with, I like the way he structures some of his arguments, and they bring out these intuitions in us. So he kind of gives an example of, in his opening, about a vigilante, um, kind of going about essentially mirroring what the government does. And then, so for example, like policing, putting people away, locking them, what he would say, like in their basement. Like, so there's a vigilante in the community that is kind of doing a service for us, protecting
Mhm.
us, making sure our rights are not invaded, kind of doing all the things like that. And then he wants to say that I think the move he makes is something like, well, in this case, imagine this vigilante who is performing this duty or this service to us, and then goes around and starts demanding that we pay him for that kind of this service, even though no one asked him to do this or do something like that. He brings out the intuition saying that we would reject something like this, or we wouldn't want to. We would have no obligation to pay him or to even listen to what he's doing or say what he's doing. And then he kind of makes the move to saying like this is kind of like how the government is, where the government gives us a service about something and then demands that we kind of pay for that service or obey them. That's very maybe more crudely a more crude version of how he would argue, but I feel like the main points are there. What do you think about that? And yeah, as far as the way he kind of goes about like the difference, I guess mainly what he wants to do is saying something like this. He puts an argument out there saying like we would reject it in this situation, but why aren't we doing this for the state if they're exactly
Right.
kind of the same thing?
Yeah, it's a really powerful argument from analogy,
Yeah.
and he's been running it for years now for good reason. It really sticks. But I think in the end, though, it doesn't work. And the reason why is that, in fact, the vigilante is disanalogous to the state. Right? It's an argument from analogy, so it turns on the vigilante and the state being relevantly similar. Now, they are, of course, similar in some respects. Like they perform some of the same physical actions. Right? The state, of course, puts people in prisons. Right? The state demands that you pay. So that those are, of course, similar, maybe even in some sense identical. But I don't think that the correct description of what the vigilante is up to and what the state are up to in terms of rights and duties is actually the same. So let's imagine that, well, let's not imagine, let's just go straight to the description. There's something that the state does what the vigilante does not do, or at least the state should do. Not all states do this, but legitimate ones do. And that's constitute the state of affairs wherein we can relate to one another as rights holders. as Mike sets up the vigilante example, we're supposed to imagine that we're already in some condition where, for whatever reason, Mike doesn't think we need states to help with this, but for whatever reason, we're all sort of in place with all of our rights, determinate, intact, ready to go. And what the vigilante does is he comes around, or she comes around, and violates them in order to bring about some good outcome. And we can grant, as Mike does, that it is a genuinely good outcome that we all have reason to want. And he suggests plausibly that we would say, you can't do that. I have a right not to be, coerced by you. And that's not a matter of how good or bad your plans are. If my neighbor right now came next door and had the most amazing plan for, community enhancement, he still couldn't drag me out or take money out of my pocket, do it. But I, of course, think that it's not the case that the state sort of shows up, as it were, to a fully sort of morally complete situation. We have all of our rights and hold them against each other. The state's activity partially constitutes our condition as right holders, right? By making our rights determinate, adjudicable, and secure, right? So given that the state does this, what the state is doing is making us into a community of rights holders to begin with. It's not showing up at an already operational community of rights holders and imposing its will. Rather, if the state's not present in structuring our rights, we relate to each other not as community of equal rights holders at all, with this set of rights to be violated, but as people subject to totally constant unfreedom within our rights due to unaccountable power in the state of nature. So for that reason, I think actually this is not a genuine analogy, because the vigilante relates in a fundamentally different moral way to his victims than the state does to its citizens.
Yeah, so it's kind of like in this vigilante, from hearing you right, it's kind of like in the analogy, we're already assuming that everyone has good equal moral standing. And then someone kind of comes in and says, hey, I'm going to perform this service even though no one asked me to do it. And then I demand that you compensate me for that. Rather, the government, we're the governments are, we're in the state of nature, and then we form the government, something like that, or a state.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's it.
I think that the example depends for its moral force on the assumption, which I think is an incorrect assumption, that our rightful situation to each other is intact prior to the appearance of the agent, the vigilante, on the scene. But of course, in the case of the government, I think that's not the case. So the analogy breaks down.
Yeah. There's also some other pushbacks that he gives. And we can go either way on this one. So depending on how we want to kind of delineate this, but something in the lines of he also makes moves towards the accountability aspect, where can we really hold the state accountable? And then he gives some rulings about how the state, at least the United States, has actually failed. And then he kind of points to, well, how can we hold someone accountable when the state, or who would we then hold accountable, or who would we then go to if we're not even actually able to appeal, or whatever the case. I forgot how we kind of words it, but it's something kind of like that, where if we do all the things that the state would like us to do, we appeal, and then the state ultimately says, well, okay, this is how we rule it. How can we hold the state accountable for something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first, I think it's important to distinguish between some person's ability to ensure that the state does what he or she believes is appropriate, which of course individuals lack in democracies anyway. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's the community, the body politics, standing to hold accountable the state and its mechanisms through the processes of democracy. If I were to have the standing to, upon being disappointed in some regard by the government, to go and successfully just enforce my will on the government, that would of course amount to my enforcing my will on my fellow citizens too, which would of course be a case of arbitrary power, and we just have our problem all over again. Now I'd be a kind of dictator. So what we're looking for is, how can we as a democratic body be in a relationship of accountability to the government? And of course the theory, which Mike correctly points out is far from fully borne out in practice, is that we hold the government account by our standard mechanisms of democracy. So, most obviously equal voting, but also, referendums, various kinds of deliberative processes, recalls, things of this character. And if we had a properly functioning democracy, although the government would not be accountable, of course, to me directly for my preferences, it would plausibly be accountable to us on equal terms for securing our interests as we understand and avow them. Now, the problem, of course, is that even switching to the democratic interpretation, there are massive, increasingly arguably terrible gaps in the reality here. So, just in the United States, it's not at all obvious that our mechanisms of voting adequately secure equal input into affairs of state for a number of reasons. Perhaps most obviously, all of our myriad and increasingly complex issues with campaign finance, capacity of various entities to contribute enormous sums of money, far, far more, thousands, millions times more than ordinary people to the political process. There are also worries about straightforward corruption, access to the polls, in fact, access to the polls that tracks and in some cases designed to track race and other demographic factors, plus the sheer just outside influence of some people, most notably very rich people, on the process writ large. All of these, among other things, do absolutely, in my judgment, undermine the accountability of the government to the people. And I think this has a serious consequence. I think this means that our state has less complete and less full authority than it would otherwise. So, unlike some views, my view is scalar. That's to say that authority comes in degrees. You want states to have more of it rather than less of it. No states, as far as I'm aware, have or ever had a perfect allotment of authority. All of them have had authority damaged or spotty in some regard. And there are reasons to worry that in the United States, the authority of the state is becoming much spottier than we should like. And that could have important consequences.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely probably a move that is appreciated. Where in the book I mean, as you're talking about, like right now with the Democratic, because again, Mike Humer, he brings up like him going to a dinner party or a dinner with some of his students, and they all vote democratically that he should pay the bill, and then he's like, okay, well, what's the difference between that and like voting, um, or at least how our democratic process currently is. But then you're kind of wanting to say, from what it sounds like, right, is that it comes in degrees, at least with accountability. And yeah, if because we're seeing possibly very flawed state going on, it lowers the accountability um, on kind of what the government is kind of issuing or telling us what we need to do.
Yeah, that's right. And to follow up on your flawed state language,
Hmm.
that's my term in the book for a state that has incomplete authority, but still enough to ground our obligation to obey it.
Hmm.
And I think that states can become, and in fact have become in history, failed states,
Yeah.
um, where that's a state where the degree of authority is so low that we would do better with respect to, respecting one another as rights holding equals by just burning it down and starting over.
Yeah.
And if that occurs, then the state no longer has any special relationship to us, and that's a real possibility. We've seen that happen in history, and there's no conceptual reason why that shouldn't happen again. So we can't really be just complacent on my view, like, oh, we live in a state that has authority. Awesome, it'll just continue to do so.
Hmm.
That's not obvious.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
I think one of the things that I kind of wished maybe would have spoken on a little bit more, because you bring in this principle that Mike may have been endorsing. I think, but in the book, I think, I don't know if he denied it, but was just unsure about what you call anti-exceptionalism, kind of the principle that he may have been operating under. Um, and that the reason why the state has authority is because it is exceptional. And I think one of the analogies you bring, and I really like it, where it had to do with parental authority, right?
Mhm.
Because in general, when you're thinking about authority, and then but then you also think about the special kind of relationship that a parent has over their kids, but it doesn't mean that the parent has absolute authority, because we definitely there's parental rights, but those rights could be revoked at any moment, which we do for, child abuse, negligence, and things like that. But yeah, if you have any comments on that, or kind of
Yeah,
your thoughts on
absolutely.
that.
'Cause I think part of Mike's argument turns on the assumption that if the state is to have authority to do what it does, it must be because anyone at all, and this is borne out by the vigilante example, must have standing to do that same thing under what he takes to be relevantly similar circumstances. So if the state has the right to put someone in jail, that must be because there's a right to put people in jail under some circumstances that states and non-states can both meet. Right. So maybe if sufficiently important goods hang on it or something like that. Um, but what I point out with the parental case is that one, most of us, maybe not all of us, but certainly most of us are inclined to think it's plausible that parental authority is a genuine kind of case, a case of authority, that is. But there, it's not the case that parents have standing to, control their young children's basically whole lives, with the exception, I mean, obviously they have to do some kind of decent job, but barring basic standards, control their whole lives. They don't have that right because of some sort of capacity that any other person, any other non-parent, right, could have. Right? So if you have some non-parent come along, and suppose this non-parent is really great, they're really kind, maybe say they're more kind than the actual parent, really smart about kids, maybe more so than the actual parent, has a better plan for the kid's education, extremely competent, make whatever list of characteristics you want. If that person comes along and picks up the kid right from the playground and starts taking the kid away, we think that's not even remotely acceptable. And if the non-parent said to the parent, no, look, you see all the features you have that might make you eligible to do this thing with this kid, I have all those and even more so. The parent can say correctly, that's not relevant here. I have a unique relationship to this child, right, such that no one else, even if they possess all the non-parental other features that I possess, can stand in this relation. Now, that doesn't mean that parental authority is just sort of random or has no explanation. There are actually quite a lot of plausible explanations for why that parental right might exist, and some philosophers talk about that. But it is special. It is exceptional. Right? Its existence turns on a special relationship that can't be replicated elsewhere. And I think that that's how the state is to the citizen, and the special relationship is precisely that of instantiating a state of affairs in which we have genuine equality within rights. Anything that does that is going to be a state, right? And then there we are back at the same point.
You have to think more about it, but yeah, it's definitely something that's like, yeah, it makes sense. I'm not. I mean, I'm not sure what side I fall on. Because I
Sure.
think you guys both make there's both good points on each side. Typically, I feel like I probably fall on the state does have authority, and there's a justification for it, and and I think in my mind, it reminds me of something like um, the relationship between like I don't know if this is a great example, but like when I think about sometimes like in some of the um, philosophy of religion type of um, literature where they'll say something like God, like, for example, they'll say like there are things that are contingent, and these contingent things, whatever, they depend upon other contingent things. But then, you'll have God, who's just like the foundation of everything, or something like that. And then they'll ask, okay, well, why isn't God a contingent being? And then they'll make the move saying like, well, God is this necessary being. He has whatever, and they'll cash that out in that way. It
Mhm.
reminds me of something that's kind of like that. And I don't know, at moment when I think about it, I don't see a problem with someone saying that, where it's like, okay, look, in general and genuine cases like the ones that Mike brings up in those kind of thought experiments, it's like, yeah, I can see why they wouldn't have the authority and why that's not kind of instantiated. But then you have something like the state, and what's the purpose of the state? Well, the purpose of the state is kind of to protect us from the deficits that you kind of lay out. And it's like, okay, well, that would make the state justified. And then to me, it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, that seems
Yeah,
a fair move to make. Yeah,
I like the appeal to that issue in theology,
yeah,
because if you get to the move of saying, "Oh, well, this being is in some sense self-explanatory or a necessary being," you do, of course, owe your interlocutor a case for why that is, right? Why we should accept that this being and not others is special in this way. But the fact that you owe your interlocutor an account doesn't mean there's no account to be given, right? If your interlocutor were just like, "Oh, come on, like there can't be any necessary beings," the theologian would say quite correctly, well, that's precisely what's at issue. I've just given you this story about why this one is necessary. Presumably, you can't argue against it by insisting that no beings are necessary.
And then
Yeah.
that's going to be that question begging against that person who is trying to give the account of why it would be necessary, or in this case, why the state would be justified.
Right.
One of another points of a disagreement that I do find interesting is that you guys talk a lot about civil disobedience, uh,
Yes.
and where I think Mike, definitely is on the stance where there are times and conditions that occur that the person or the civilian is um, totally justified, and it's very permissible to disobey the state. But then he also comments that they are also not willing to. They also the state, they should not accept punishment from the state as well. And I know
Right.
there's some disagreement between all that. So, but yeah, if you'd like to touch upon
Absolutely.
civil
So,
disobedience,
so I distinguish between civil from mere conscientious refusal, that is breaking the law because you think the law is too evil to be obeyed, and civil disobedience, which is a specific kind or class of conscientious refusal. And I think that, barring some maybe very exceptional circumstances, citizens should engage in civil disobedience if they feel that they need to break the law because it's too evil to be obeyed. And civil disobedience, unlike merely refusing to obey the law, has a kind of a few characteristics that are salient. So one is that it's open. You when you engage in civil disobedience, you break the law openly. So think of, for instance, the famous lunch counter sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina, in the early '60s, where three young, or maybe five, a handful of young black men came to the lunch counter at a Woolworths and sat down and ordered coffee. This was, of course, very open, and that was part of the point. Um, why did they do it openly? Because, and this takes us to our next feature, civil disobedience is communicative. And civil disobedience is a communicative act that says to your fellow citizens, hey, this law, even though it does have the sort of official mark of the law through our processes, just can't stand as law in this community. It's too evil, it's too at odds with the standards that constitute our legal culture. So we are going to publicly break it here in front of all of you to communicate to you that this is intolerable, right? This can't stand. Um, and then third, once you are punished, as for instance those young men in wool and the lunch counter were, you, again, barring extremely exceptional circumstances, should go to court, make your case, and accept your punishment. Why? Because I draw a distinction that I'm not sure Mike does accept, between particular laws and their justice or injustice, and the law or the rule of law in a community. And although a particular law may merit our disrespect, so for instance, the law that says black citizens can't eat lunch at this counter, that doesn't on its own entail that the law or rule of law in the community doesn't merit our respect. And what we do when we engage in civil disobedience is we say to our fellow citizens throughout the process, from action, open action for communication, followed by due process, including acceptance, is say, we respect the rule of law. We respect the rule of law because we respect all of you as equals, and the law is what constitutes our equal standing within our rights. So we're going to do this through the law as a way of showing respect for the law, but disrespect and disregard for the particular law that we think undermines the law as a whole. So civil disobedience is sort of inside of a respect for law framework, whereas other kinds of conscientious law breaking may not be. And I think that as long as the state is still not failed, is still a merely flawed state, that we're trying to salvage, not something that we've decided to give up on and burn down, we owe our fellow citizens, civil disobedience.
Yeah, I guess for clarity too, when you mean by like accepting punishment, is there like a limit to like the kind of punishment that one would be accepting to? So I'm thinking of like, maybe they are sentenced to like life in prison or something like that. It would, because I think from his point of view, and I definitely understand it, where it's like, okay, you have like the segregation laws, let's just say back when they were instantiated, very like they're unjust, right? And so if the law's already unjust, in Mike's mind, he's like, why the citizens have no obligation to obey it. if they don't have obligation to obey the law, then they definitely don't have any obligation to obey the punishment that follows from it.
And I
Um,
think the answer is
yeah,
they do have an obligation to obey the law,
mm,
right? Or
not the
the
particular law,
system of
but
rule
like
of law,
overall. Yeah.
but not this particular law, right? And what respect is owed to is the law, right? The
Mhm.
legal culture of the community, not to the particular law. So yes, if the law is unjust, you're not obligated to obey it. That's why it's permissible to disobey it.
Mhm.
But still this other thing, again, which I don't think Mike recognizes the existence of,
Mhm.
which I call the rule of law. And we can owe our allegiance and our obligation to that, even if we don't owe our obedience rather, to a particular law that's a part of the rule of law. And I think that it's that important distinction which makes it possible for civil disobedience as opposed to mere conscientious
Yes.
refusal
Yeah.
to make sense.
It kind of seems like you probably could start like a whole revolution if there wasn't something that wasn't. I'm just kind of think of like maybe even consequentially, right? So like if you have, well, I guess the law, there are certain parameters or some things that need to be. Well, here's my thought.
Yeah.
It's more something like this, where okay, you have something that's unjust, a law that's being broken unjustly, or sorry, there's an unjust law, citizens
Mhm.
disobey it, but then they also, for let's just argument's sake, that they don't accept the punishment. Um,
Yeah.
in other cases, if it's deemed to be unjust and or other laws seem to be unjust, it seems as if like you could have like this, cons- I don't know, slippery slope or cascading event where no one just respects the law anymore, or
Sure.
a punishment. I guess it kind of. I'm not saying you're using like there's like a consequentialist type of argument there, but it's more of like if they're not going to accept the punishment, but it's not because they're accepting like they're, how do I want to word this? They're not just submitting to the state. They're submitting to something I guess that's above the state. And I think you use an example of like Martin Luther King's that are in a
Mhm.
Birmingham jail where it's like he is submitting to not necessarily the state, quote unquote, even though the
Yeah.
state's like punishing him. He's submitting to like the law, which you kind of what you're calling as the rule of law, which is like more respect for that rather than how people are kind of going about implementing that law.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Dr. King does a phenomenal job with this, drawing this distinction between an unjust law, which in his view fails to be a law at all,
Mm,
versus the law of the community, which King continues to take seriously and takes that himself and the people receiving his letter, the white clergy, all to be equally bound under. And he's addressing them as people who are um, bound or trying to live together under this system of law, which has these kinds of cancerous pseudo laws of racism attached to them. And King is trying to explain why he was quite right to disobey those out of regard for the rule of law that this community is trying, not very successfully, but trying to share. And I think I should note, I don't hold the view that civil disobedience is truly the only permissible way to ever break the law. So, for instance, some black radicals during the 60s argued, I think not implausibly, that actually they were living in a failed state, that there was no rule of law, that the rule of law was simply white power being wielded against them, that the right response was not sort of respect for rule of law shared between them and their white citizens, but to revolt, start over, burn it down. That, for instance, was part of the view of the people associated with Malcolm X and his movement, and that is not obviously wrong. I mean, it could end up being wrong, but not obviously so. So you could end up in situations where we actually things have gotten so bad that there really isn't a rule of law left to respect. And in that case, the parameters of civil disobedience are not in place and you're just at war.
yeah.
And I think that the alternatives are a kind of civil disobedience or else a kind of civil war.
Hmm. Perfect. So moving on a little bit, then we can kind of talk about I think one more thought experiment that Mike Humer likes to bring out, and it was this kind of diners democratic voting system that he kind of wants us to draw out. But anyway, if you'd like to explain it, and then we can.
Sure. And yeah, I'm eager to talk about this because I think democracy is on many of our minds right now, and I don't want to leave this discussion without replying to this very important and thought provoking thought experiment, which I think is nonetheless incorrect. And seeing how it fails will help us see why it does matter that we go out and do democracy now and in other times. So Mike points out, I think correctly, that if he were to go out to dinner with some colleagues and they all eat dinner, the bill comes, everyone takes a vote. We all want Mike to pay. Um, suppose it's whatever, just to make it easy. Suppose it's unanimous. Um, he says correctly, I think, I have no obligation at all to pay. But look, here I am. I'm a member of a group. The group took a vote. The vote dictated clearly that I am to pay. So how is that any different from the case of actual political democracy, where you have a body of people, in this case, several hundred million citizens, not diners at a restaurant, taking a vote on what to do or who to have in charge? If you don't have to submit to the judgment of the fellow diners, why do you have to submit to the judgment of the body politic? And I think that what goes wrong with this is actually structurally the same as what goes wrong with the vigilante thought experiment. So if we show up at dinner, right, with all of our rights already established, we relate to one another as equals within our rights, um, and someone just tries to make me do stuff, whether alone or with a group of people agreeing, well, I presumably have a right not them not to do that. That's not cool. That's not an okay way to treat me. But by hypothesis, that in the case of the democratic community of citizens, it's that body and its democratic powers that constitutes the possibility of our relating as equals in the first place. So I think that the reason why the democratically governed state has standing or can have standing to enforce its judgments on you, pay whatever percent income tax, is not because it is a body of which you're a part and the body took a vote and rendered an outcome. That, as the diner example shows, is not sufficient for the judgment that you have to do what the body says. Rather, it's a very special kind of body. What kind? The kind that makes it possible for you to live with your equals, in this case, your fellow voters, on terms of equality within your rights in the first place. And the democratic process is how we do the accountability holding that constitutes that very equality. So I think that although the body politic case and the diner's case each does have something in common with the other, namely there is a body of people, there's a vote, there's a decision, and there's an attempt at enforcement, the moral situation is actually not analogous at all. And I think that undercuts the case.
It goes back. I was just thinking about a little bit of the topic again. Is political authority an illusion? Maybe I mean, because it's kind of more of the abstract. I feel like in some cases someone can kind of if someone points to concrete examples, I feel like someone can easily say like they can easily say, well, ideally maybe that is an unjust law, but this is how I possibly answer or something like that. If the title was like, is the U.S. Does the U.S. have political authority or something like that, or is that an illusion? I feel like there could be probably a stronger case, especially some of the examples that Mike brings. I also think that maybe I know you didn't necessarily have this in your responses, but I do wonder. Kind of, I don't know if I want to research this, but I probably should. But he brings out good examples of cases where the state wasn't held accountable,
Mhm.
or things that are. He gives an example about people calling the police multiple times, and then a lot of bad things happen to them as a result, and then they sue the state or they sue the agency or the police station or whatever, I think, and then the response was like, well, the police aren't like they're I forgot how it's worded, but they're not directly in public service to one individual, something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
it seems like the fact that citizens can attempt to, hold police departments to account by taking them to court and getting remedies for serious harms that are the result of their negligence. The fact that that is not successful under our legal culture and the courts have rejected that might seem to count strongly against the claim that there is accountability of the kind I need for my view in place in the
yeah,
United States.
yeah. As just as much, I feel like there's probably those cases that are there. I wonder if there's also cases where the courts or things like that have been held accountable, and I feel like there probably are. And it kind of makes me wonder if there's like a selection effect or a selection bias where it's like, here's all the times where the state wasn't held accountable. But it seems it's just as easy. Here are times where actually it was held accountable. Um,
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of selection bias there, but in fairness, I think he does have a point, which is that
mhm,
um,
for sure.
individuals and groups are not typically um, r- reliably able to hold
Yeah.
government entities to account by way of the same means that we hold one another and
Yeah.
firms to account.
Yeah.
So if I think that, I don't know, you've damaged me somehow, I can take you to court,
Hmm.
right? And we'll face each other on more or less equal terms. I just have to establish how and whether and how you wrong me and to what value, and off we
Hmm.
go.
Hmm.
He's right that that's not typically the case in individual or even individual government or even firm to government um, relations. And I
Hmm.
think that shows that there's one kind of accountability that's lacking, like tort accountability, or the kind of accountability of bringing the law against an equal party for reclamation of damages. That's certainly true. Ideally, though, that's okay in principle. Not, I mean, in principle, it's important to emphasize here because I think for other reasons the police are not properly accountable. But
Right.
in principle, this could be okay if the police department is accountable to each of us through this other process, this other inherently collective democratic process, right, where we achieve control of those powerful groups in the government by way of our collective will through voting, through things like a referendum, things like
Hmm.
that. I think the deep problem is that that's not very reliable in this country either.
Hmm. Hmm.
As far as
Yeah.
most of the data suggests, there are a lot of groups, including a lot of police departments, that really are substantially, in all respects, far too unaccountable. And I think that's true. I think that's a serious problem, and I think it damages the quality of American government authority every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And but it goes back into the questions, right? It damages a little bit of the legitimacy of the state, and it also damages, or at least sets back some of that obligation of its citizens, obeying what the state is wanting to do.
Yeah. Although I
Um,
should no, just for clarity, on my view, although um, accountability, sorry, although legitimacy, right, the right to rule,
mhm,
sort of comes in degrees.
mhm,
Typically, I think the duty to obey, sort of, I mean, not always, but typically comes in a kind of on or off. Um, well, barring civil disobedience. Barring civil disobedience, it comes in a kind of on or off binary because your state is sort of flawed. Okay, we should keep doing what it says because we respect each other better by doing
mhm,
what it says than starting over.
yeah.
And now it's failed.
No.
Right, so
Yeah.
now it's gotten so bad that the best way to respect one another as equals is just to start over. So,
Mm,
barring civil disobedience, I think
mhm,
typically we do have a more or less stable duty to obey, even across fluctuations
mhm.
of accountability, so long as we're above the frankly quite hard to identify flawed versus failed state line.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting situation because typically, in the literature too, when we're contrasting, like, we're trying to justify the state, it's between, do we want to, what would the state of nature look like, and kind of how you lay it out in the beginning, the three defects. We have that, but then on the other hand, you have the other side. So imagine that's one side, completely opposite side, where it's like, well, what if we, we're in a situation, right, where like our rights are always being overridden, things in that and
Yeah,
kind of that nature where we're like, well, like how Mike brings out like democracy or like majority voting, kind of what I think Plato may have called the tyranny of democracy, where you have majority rules kind of thing. Um, but you have the opposite effect of that. And so I feel like that's what makes it a very tricky situation to where, I think that's why it's a tricky situation. And I think it's very helpful how you have the flawed versus the failed. Because even though, we're more like most likely we're humans in general. So it's like, or in general, we're humans. So we're going to live in some type of flawed system. Um,
right.
that kind of like already going to be embedded there. But lastly, before we head out in closing, so re-summarize your position, and if there's anything that you would like to do differently, now that you've kind of had the experience of doing this kind of debate format, is there anything different that you would like to put in, or anything you would wish you would have said, and then where people can find you?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess in closing, I'll say that I think this issue has a special kind of urgency right now. Because there's, I think, a lot of deep disaffection with politics and the political process. Lots of thinking that, this doesn't really matter. Like, this is, stuff goes on, people get elected, it's all the same to me. And I think those judgments are not, strictly speaking, irrational, because I think a lot of the operation of our democracy, of the kind that I say is so important, really isn't going that well. But I don't think our state is failed yet. I think it can be saved. I think it really matters whether it's saved, because whether it's saved determines whether we can continue to relate to each other as these free and equal right holders in the way that we have, and we really should want to continue living. So things are, I think, not good with respect to the state of especially American political authority. But I don't think that's a reason to give up. I think that's a reason to try to do better. I think there's still hope that we can do better and make our democracy have more of the features that I say in this book it ought to have. In terms of what I'd like to do additionally, I think it would be fun to do a version of this that shows more clearly how some of our most important sources of political ideas sort of weave into this narrative. I gave some discussion of those. I gave some little shout outs to Kant and Locke and stuff like that. But I'm also a historian of philosophy, and I think that those ideas really, really matter. And I think another cool kind of book on the same level could show, look how we share this set of really cool and highly contested ideas, and we can draw out of them this legacy of liberal democracy that I've been defending. I think at some point it could be cool to do a book on this kind of level that has that focus.
Perfect. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast. Before you head out, would you mind telling our listeners where they can find you, books you've written on, and things like that? Yeah.
Absolutely. So you can find me on email. It's dalayman@davidson.edu. I'm also on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. You can find me there. I'm also on academia.edu. I should be easy to find on all those platforms. I'm also the author of, speaking of history of philosophy, a book about John Locke and his reception in the 19th century called Locke Among the Radicals. It's about how some 19th century thinkers kind of dug Locke up, because of course by then Locke was already really old, and reintroduced his property theory to some new contexts. And I also edit the journal Locke Studies. So if you're interested in the history of thought, that's a free online journal with some really cool content that you might want to check out.
Perfect. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And that concludes another episode. Have a happy new year, and see you next time.